This video is about the concepts of the short run and the long run. These concepts relate to the production process. First, we need to do a little bit of preliminary clarification on the types of inputs that we're talking about. Now, in a business, an entrepreneur is going to acquire and organize resource inputs and use them to produce goods and services that it sells as output. Now, how did we get from inputs to outputs? Well, there was a production process which occurred. And we can use a neat little kind of mantra or formula for expressing that production process. We can say that labour works with capital in a space to transform raw materials into output. Now, this little mantra is handy because it includes and kind of classifies the types of inputs involved. We've got labour, which is workers, human beings, and they work with capital. Capital here means tools, equipment, and then we've got space, that is the land on which a factory, for example, or an office space will be located. And we've got raw materials. So raw materials here are all of those inputs into the production process that are not workers and they're not machines that are used in the production process. So the raw materials are the things that are ultimately transformed in some way to create a new kind of thing, a new product or a new service that previously didn't exist. Sometimes raw materials are called intermediate inputs because they might not be raw materials. They might not be dirt, for example, or crude oil. They could be, say, for example, in a car factory, they would be tyres, for example. Tyres aren't capital, they're not machines that are used to produce cars. They're things that are used to create the car that ultimately go into the object called the car. Classifying inputs into these categories of labour, capital, space, raw materials is usually pretty straightforward. So if you think of, for example, a t-shirt manufacturer, you've got the factory with the sewing machines in it. You acquire the raw materials, which would be cloth and thread, and then you hire workers. That's the labour, and you put them together to produce t-shirts. Okay, that's easy enough. But sometimes there will be cases where it's not entirely clear how to classify a particular input. So, for example, if we were to take the case of an internet search company, obviously the internet search company will employ people, labour, and it will have computers, so that's capital, in an office space, and so that's all straightforward, and it'll use electricity, that's raw material, so to speak, in order to produce output, which is search engine results for you and your friends. But a couple of the inputs into the production process are, for example, software programs and databases. So how would we classify the software programs? Where do they fit into this story? Well, it's best to think of it in terms of the mantra. Labour works on capital in a space to transform raw materials into output. So the workers utilize the computers and they're utilizing software in a space to transform raw materials into output. So the software programs are actually classified as capital in that case. What about the databases of people's internet histories that the search engine company utilizes. How do we classify that? Well, it's not labor, and it's not some kind of machine or virtual machine. It's certainly not a space. It's the raw materials on which the workers using computers and software operate. They transform people's search engine histories, people's internet histories, search histories, into output results, that is, search engine results for you and your friends. Okay, now we're ready to talk about the short run. So what do we mean by that? The short run does not really refer to a specified period of time. It doesn't mean, for example, 6 months. It means a situation in which a firm can't change the quantity of at least one input into the production process. This we would classify as a fixed input. So let's take the case of go back to our t-shirt manufacturer. In the short run, we might say that the t-shirt manufacturer can't change the size of the factory that they have or the number of machines in that factory. We would say this is fixed. These are the fixed inputs. It usually means that there will be at least one input which can be changed, and we classify this as the variable input, the changeable input. So, in our example, we can add more workers to our factory, and we can add more raw materials to the production process, and we can decrease them if we want as well, in order to change the amount of output which is produced. Now, that's just an example. As to which types of inputs are classified as fixed and which are classified as variable actually depends on the type of firm that you're looking at, or more broadly, the industry that you're looking at, assuming the firms in that industry are all roughly the same. So, for example, let's take this case here. This is what we might call hole-in-the-wall cafe that's in Parramatta. So, what are the fixed and variable inputs for this cafe in the short run? Well, we would say that the cafe can change the amount of coffee beans and milk that it purchases, can increase it or decrease it, depending on demand for coffees. So that the raw materials, we would say, or the intermediate inputs, are variable. However, all of the other inputs in this particular case are actually fixed in the short run. The size of the cafe is obviously fixed. You can't change that in the same way as you could just order more coffee beans. Equally, the coffee machine can't really be changed. You can't change the number of coffee machines because the space is simply too small. There's not enough space to add another coffee machine. So the capital in this case is also fixed. Equally, because it's such a small space, you can't really change, in the short run, the amount of labor. There's only really room for one person in that cafe to work in that cafe. So the amount, in this case, the amount of labor is fixed. So this is in contrast to our example of the t-shirt manufacturer. You've got a large factory, you can add more workers, you can sack workers. In this case, in order to change the amount of production, in this case, you've really stuck with one worker and that's it. So what about the long run? Well, this is easy, because the long run is simply a situation where the firm is able to change the quantities of all of its inputs. That is, all of its inputs are variable. All of its inputs can be changed. Our t-shirt manufacturer, in the short run, can't change the size of the factory or can't build another factory. or can't add more machinery. But in the long run, that's a situation where the firm can extend the size of the factory and put in more machines. Or it can build an entirely new factory next door and fill that with machines and workers and raw materials. So this is the long run. In the long run, all of the inputs can be changed. And so we can say that in the long run, a firm can change the entire scale of its operations. It's not simply adding more workers to a given factory. You can build new factories. So let's do a little roundup summary using a conventional division of inputs. We've got the inputs of labour, raw materials or intermediate goods, capital, which remember is machines, tools, equipment, and space, or in other words, basically land. And there will be corresponding labels for the payments for those inputs. So labour is paid wages, raw materials is paid, well, there's no technical term for the payments to raw materials, so I'm just going to call it raw material payments. In the case of capital, the payment that is made for that is interest. And you might say, well, that seems a bit strange. Why would that be the case? Sometimes, and in some textbooks, you'll find that the payment for capital might be rent. For example, so some machinery is, by some firms, is just rented machinery. So laptops, for example, or sometimes earth-moving equipment, that would be rented for a period of time. So that's an alternative term for the payment of capital. But often if it's fixed capital or large capital, like a factory, for example, then we might say that the payment for that is interest, because often, in order to build a factory, the entrepreneur will borrow money to do that. So the price, in inverted commas, that they are paying for the money to build or acquire the factory is the interest payments on that loan. And then we've got space or land, and the conventional term for the payment of space or land is rent. So a conventional division in the short run is this, that labour and raw materials are variable inputs, and so the payments for those, or the costs of employing those inputs, are called variable costs. And the capital, machinery, tools, the factory, and the space on which it's located, these inputs are traditionally, conventionally, fixed inputs. So the payments for those fixed inputs, the costs of acquiring those fixed inputs, are called fixed costs. In the long run, there are no fixed inputs. Labour, raw materials, capital, and space can be changed. And so all of the inputs are variable in the long run, and so we can say all of these costs of these inputs are variable in the long run, so we can label them all together as variable costs. You might say, well, where's the, you might remember from another video or from your textbook, where's the entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial ability and so on? Well, that could be embedded within these. So, for example, some of the labour might be classified as the entrepreneur's labour. Right? So there's the labour of the workers that are hired, and that's explicit costs of wages. And then there's the labour of the entrepreneur, and that would be implicit wages. That's an implicit cost, which is incorporated in wages here. Okay? Or it might be that the entrepreneur owns some land which they're using for their business. in which case the rent here would be an implicit cost. Okay? That is, the rent that they are foregoing, that they are giving up in order to run their business. Okay? So we could say that these implicit costs, that is, the costs of entrepreneurship, are embedded within some of these categories here. But if we wanted to separate it out, if we want to say, no, these are just these are the all inputs which have been purchased, and so these are all explicit costs, then we would want to add to that a separate category of entrepreneurship. And say, okay, so the implicit costs here are classified as a separate category, a separate payment in the form of what we sometimes call normal profit. It's the entrepreneur's salary that they pay themselves. And that, in the short run, would be a fixed cost. And in the long run, could be a variable cost.